Good morning and welcome to SAM.gov for public libraries. My name is Lauren Abner and I'm the state E-rate coordinator for Kentucky Public Libraries. So this is one of the rare opportunities when I get to present on something that isn't 100% E-rate, but it's a little bit of E-rate. Always have to have some E-rate in these presentations. So we're going to keep it simple. The agenda is rather short, but there are a lot of technical details in what we'll be discussing. If you are using the slides after the presentation, you can click on the links in the agenda to jump to various sections, depending on what you need. So first up, what is SAM.gov and why should I care? Because I always want to know why I should bother, doing something. I think this is really important for public libraries to know. So SAM.gov is the System for Award Management. It's a federal government portal managed by the General Services Administration. You use it to register to do business with the U.S. government, whether you're going to be a recipient of a grant or whether you intend to apply to be a federal contractor. You can update, renew, or check the status of your entity's registration. You can also search in the system for the registrations of other entities and also for exclusion records. So generally for a public library, you're probably not going to be looking at exclusions, but just to let you know, the system does show if an entity has been excluded from getting federal contracts or subcontracts, for various reasons. So that's part of the reason that our agency uses it, is to make sure that when we're granting to libraries that they are eligible to receive that funding. So SAM.gov is your passport to federal funds. Since 2022, the Unique Entity Identifier, or UEI, assigned in SAM.gov is now the identifier that has replaced the DUNS number. That was the Data Universal Numbering System number that was assigned by a private company, Dun & Bradstreet. So starting in 2022, the DUNS number was eliminated from the registration in SAM.gov, and any registered entities at that time automatically received a unique entity identifier. And now, for any entity that isn't already registered in the system, part of the process is obtaining a UEI before you do your registration. So the UEI is a one-time thing. Once you request it, that remains your entity's identifier, basically forever. But entity registration has to be renewed on a yearly basis. The entity registration provides your direct deposit information, points of contact, and just other details that the federal government needs to know if they're going to be giving you money somehow. So prime recipients of federal funding receive direct deposits directly from the federal government. So for example, the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives, as a state library agency, receives direct deposits through SAM.gov for our funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which we sometimes subgrant out. So subgrantees or subawardees of federal funding are receiving grants from prime recipients. So that's an example where KDLA will be granting to an eligible public library. And generally, if you're getting federal funds, even if you're not the prime recipient, you still have to maintain active entity registration as well. And for registration, I think it's really important that you maintain it at all times because, of course, you want to receive KDLA grants. It's also relevant for E-rate if you have to file your own forms for reimbursement for E-rate. You have to have active registration starting in August of 2026. If you don't have active registration when you file your reimbursement form, the funds won't go out because they will start using SAM.gov. And then, of course, you want to be prepared in the event of a disaster. So in 2022, we had a couple of libraries that were badly impacted by the flooding and of that summer, and they had to kind of scramble to get themselves set up in the system to receive FEMA grants to help with repairing damage and reconstructing after those floods. So you don't want to have to be rushing to do this when you've just had a natural disaster and maybe you don't have your paperwork all handy. So you want to maintain this at all times. It's important to note that SAM.gov is always free. So it's free to sign up for your SAM.gov account. It's free to obtain a UEI. It's free to submit and renew your registration. Unfortunately, there are a lot of pesky companies that really want entities to pay processing fees so that the company can handle registration on behalf of the entity. And this might be something that could be useful for, big companies, as an example, but no Kentucky Public Library needs to be paying $400 or $600 as a processing fee. So official reminders about your registration come from do-not-reply@sam.gov. So if you're getting a renewal reminder and it's not from that SAM.gov email, you can ignore it because it's from a company that may, in a very tricky way, be trying to represent themselves as something official to do with SAM.gov. And sometimes they also make it sound like you've used their company in the past, even though you haven't. If you ever get a message and you're not sure if it's legit or not, please feel free to contact me. I'm glad to, look over a message. Just be really wary. So as I said, your SAM.gov account is free. So you need an account even to get into the system to look for entities. If you want to create an entity, submit the registration, anything like that, you've got to get an account for SAM.gov. SAM.gov uses the federal login system, just called login.gov. So if you already have a login.gov account, you would use those credentials to log in and accept the terms and conditions specifically for SAM.gov. For that account, you have to choose at least one multi-factor authentication method. Do note that email is not on the list. You can get a text or phone call, and several libraries have set up to get phone calls directly to the library where a recording repeats the 6-digit code a few times so that you can log into the system. That's sometimes nice if you want to avoid having your personal cell phone associated with this system. I personally use an authenticator app. I use Google Authenticator for my login. We do have some folks who use backup codes, but I do want to warn you that if you only have backup codes, that's a really easy way to lose access to your account. Because if you can't find those codes, you have to go through the process of deleting your account and starting all over as a new user. And that means you'd have to get reaffiliated with your entity. And that's just a lot of extra work. So it's fine to use backup codes as maybe a second authentication factor, but please make sure you've selected at least one other option on the list. All right, so for many libraries, they're already in the system. They're already in SAM.gov and have registered in the past, may have a unique entity identifier assigned, because we've been using SAM.gov for federal funding since at least the mid-2000s. So there are a number of libraries in the system that maybe have inactive registration. So they already exist, but they need a staff member to gain access to that. So in order to gain access, this is in a situation where maybe you know that the account administrator is still around from the library and they're passing on responsibilities to you. You can log into the system and look at the workspace. The workspace is basically where you start almost any action that you'll be taking to set up an entity or gain access to one. So at the bottom of the page, there's an option for request a role. You can request data entry access for entity registration. You verify that you have a business need for the role and hit request role. You then have to fill in some information to find the entity that you want to be associated with. If you know the unique entity identifier, that is the most exact, precise way to find that entity in the system. So again, data entry, entity registration, and a note. So if there is still an active account administrator assigned to that unique entity identifier, then that person will receive a message to approve your access to the system. But do note that that UEI must also have some kind of registration with it. If only the UEI has been assigned and there's never been registration, you can't request a role for that entity. Now, a lot of libraries are in a situation where there isn't a staff member remaining who still has a login for the system. They're not affiliated with the entity. So in order to get access, you have to submit an entity administrator appointment letter. And I do want to note that it's possible that in the past you were the administrator for your entity in the system, but you have been removed. If entity registration lapses by 2 years or more, then the system automatically removes all of the account administrators. So again, maybe you set up your entity in the past, but to get access again, you may still need to do this letter. To make the request, you need to have your individual SAM.gov user account set up under a work email. You'll go to an FAQ page about entity administrators and download a template. For any Kentucky library, you want template 1 for single entities. Page 1 of that document has instructions. Pages 2 and 3 have text that you will copy onto library letterhead and carefully complete. You'll need to enter the unique entity identifier, entity name, and physical address exactly as it appears in SAM.gov. And I do want to emphasize exactly because, depending on how outdated the information is, maybe the library name isn't exactly what you think it should be. Maybe it's the old physical address. But for purposes of this letter, when you're filling in the body of the letter with the information, you're going to copy whatever is in SAM.gov exactly, even if it's wrong, because everything has to be all matchy-matchy on this letter. Also, you need to make sure that the way your name appears when you sign the letter and the name associated with your individual SAM.gov user account are the same. So for example, if your name is Peter Smith, you don't want to sign the letter Pete Smith. That seems obvious, but any kind of mismatch like that will result in your letter being rejected. It's not uncommon to have to do the letter 2 to 3 times. So you'll print it, sign it, have to have it notarized, and scan it back to PDF. You'll then return to that FAQ page, and that has instructions for submitting the letter to the Federal Service Desk. It usually takes about 3 days for them to process your letter, so you can get access to the entity again fairly quickly. All right, so let's say that you're a library that's never really dealt with SAM.gov before and you need to get your UEI. Fortunately for Kentucky libraries, I think we only have about 6 libraries that don't have a UEI at this point. But since this is an important step in the process, I did want to go ahead and cover this. So just a quick disclaimer that SAM.gov changes the pages for requesting a unique entity identifier on a regular basis. Honestly, the reason I haven't done this training sooner is because the system was constantly undergoing changes. So I made screen caps about this process in early May 2026. But by the time you're watching this recording, it's very possible that the pages will look a little different. So don't necessarily freak out if what you're seeing is somewhat different. That's just how it's going to be with SAM.gov. So hopefully you'll take the general concepts of what we cover and you'll be able to apply it to however the system is going to look when you happen to be logging in to do this. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't note that the SAM.gov system is kind of glitchy. So it is prone to technical issues. So it's not uncommon to receive an error message that will say, sorry, something went wrong. Now, sometimes you can just click on a button again, refresh a page, redo an action, and it might go on through. But sometimes it's just not going to work that day. And there's not any clear reason why. You just have to stop that day and come back another day to complete what you were trying to work on. So for SAM.gov, I wish I could say that you log in once and you get everything you need done and then you move on. And that may not be the case. You may have to come back a couple times to get something done. All right, so to start the process of creating a new entity on the workspace, you'll click on the button that says Add New Entity. Now, I do have links here to the registration information that is linked to on the page. If you want to get an idea of what this process will entail before you start, you can go to the Entity Registration Checklist. I do want to note that the entity registration checklist is split into two sections. The first section is for companies that want to be federal contractors. They're applying for what we call all awards. And so that is the first 11 pages of that registration checklist. As a government entity that just wants financial assistance, you're going to skip to page 12 for the financial assistance section, which is shorter. It doesn't have all the same questions. So on the welcome page, click on Create New Entity, of course. You're going to choose as your goal that you want to do business directly with the U.S. federal government. And then you can select an intention for why you're doing this. And for most libraries, apply for federal financial assistance will be the best option. You want to make good selections here because the system will kind of steer you to the right type of registration. Then you need to answer who required your entity to be in SAM.gov. So there are a couple of ways you could fill this out. For libraries that participate in E-rate, you might select the first option for federal government, and then from a drop-down, you can indicate that it's the Federal Communications Commission that is requiring your entity to be in SAM.gov. Or you could choose the second option for U.S. state or territory government or office, and then choose the appropriate state from the drop-down. That might be a good option if you're doing this to receive federal funds administered by KDLA. It doesn't really make a difference what you answer here, so just go with whatever seems simplest and most accurate for your library. This page is very important. So this is usually where people kind of go astray and they choose an option that puts them on a really difficult path. So if you're an entity and you need a unique entity identifier, you probably need the registration to go with it as well. So your best option is going to be what they mark in the recommended column, which is financial assistance. So that just means that you would be a recipient, whether it's a prime recipient or a sub-recipient, sub-awardee for federal funding. So that includes the Library Services and Technology Act, that includes E-rate, that includes FEMA. So you want to hit select on that appropriate column. And I will say this again later, do not select all awards. Now I know the words all awards sounds tempting because of course you want all of the awards, you want to get all of the money, but it's a misleading title. That means you're applying to be a federal contractor and you will face more questions and they will be more difficult. And honestly, that is the #1 mistake that libraries make when trying to do their registration, whether for the first time or a renewal, is making the wrong selection, and then they're getting weird questions that they don't know how to answer. So again, financial assistance is the way to go. Next up, indicate that yes, you are registering a government entity. So any Kentucky library will be answering yes on this question because library districts are a unit of local government. If there are libraries in other states watching this and you're a nonprofit, you might choose no here. Possibly you'll face different questions. For purposes of this presentation, I've selected the option that is correct for all Kentucky public libraries. So keep in mind, it may not be right if you were a library in another state. So once you've determined that you're a government entity, you need to select your entity type. So that should be U.S. local governments. There's a rather long definition of, the units of government that count as local government. You'll note that special district is on the list. And so as libraries are library districts and often taxing districts, they would qualify as special districts for this purpose. So please choose U.S. local government. Then you get a confirmation page showing your entity type and the purpose of your registration. So it should be local government, and the purpose should be financial assistance awards. And then you'll get into the business information section. So in the past year or so, the system has changed. It used to be that you could request your unique entity identifier if you knew the year that your entity was established and the state it was established in. It's possible that the system could go ahead and automatically assign the unique entity identifier to you. That is no longer the case. You are going to have to provide entity validation documents, documents plural, in order to get the unique entity identifier assigned. So I've linked to 2 different versions of the requirements. The first link that says entity validation document requirements. If you look at list B, that has the options for the type of paperwork that can be submitted to prove that your entity was established in a particular state, on a particular date. So often that's going to be something like the fiscal court citation from the creation of the library taxing district, or it could be a copy of the articles of incorporation that are stamped by some kind of certifying authority like your local fiscal court. There's also another version that says, can I use this document for entity validation? I like that one because the chart has kind of colorful check marks or X's for things that can be used in certain ways, but it also includes examples of documentation that won't work. And I think sometimes knowing something won't work will save you some hassle if you're not finding an option that seems workable. You don't want to waste your time submitting documentation that's going to get rejected. So I do recommend taking a look at that list. All right, so once you start on the business information section, you'll do an entity search. So you're going to be entering the library's legal business name and the address, and hopefully the system is going to have good results for you. Now, I do want to point out that SAM.gov doesn't really indicate the sources of its information. I know that some of it is from local Secretary of State websites for business registrations. That's an obvious source. I do believe there's some old DUNS number information in the system, but otherwise we don't really know where the information is pulled from. So if you do a search and you're not finding a result for your library, you may need to put in the old library name. Like we've got some libraries that used to be a memorial library and they switched over to a county library name. So you might have to look under the old name for the library, or you might have to use, a prior physical address. Every once in a while, a mailing address has shown up in the system, but it really should be under the physical address. So if possible, you want to find some kind of entry that works for your library, even if it's not quite right. It's easier to, I think, fix an existing entity information result than it is to create something brand new. So in the results in this example, I was searching for Shelby County Public Library. Luckily, there was a good hit in the system, so I would check that top option. You'll probably find some other Shelby County entities with nearby addresses in the results. So again, you want to select the best possible result that is somehow affiliated with your library. If some of the information is wrong, you can submit documentation to correct the name or correct the address. Go back to that entity validation document requirement list and find the appropriate documentation, and it's going to take 1 to 3 business days for that request to be processed. So that's just another example of how you might log in to get this process done, and it may not be a one-time deal. You may have to come back and get some information fixed before you can move forward with your registration. So do keep that in mind. Then on the Confirm Entity Details page, you can indicate whether or not the business name and address are correct. If there are changes, then of course you'll be prompted to upload documentation in the system. If everything looks good, you can say no, you don't need to do any updates, and you can move forward. Then you need to enter the entity information. So you'll enter the mailing address if it is different than the physical address, or you can check a box to say that the mailing address and physical address are the same. Then you'll add incorporation details. So for the first section, for the start date, you're going to put whatever matches your documentation to show when you were established. So again, for most Kentucky libraries, this is probably going to be the creation of the library taxing district, and often these are dates in the 60s or 70s. It's possible that your library actually started earlier, but again, you need a date that is associated with paperwork that you can submit. So it may be a more recent date than you're thinking. And then for fiscal close, any Kentucky library is going to be entering June 30th as the fiscal close for each state fiscal year. And then, of course, enter the state of incorporation. Then on the next page, you will be asked to provide documentation for the entity start date. The document needs to have the legal business name of the library and the start year in the documentation. So you'll make that upload. You can submit comments if needed. And then, of course, you'll be waiting for SAM.gov to review the information. So you do get a chance to double check your information before you submit to SAM.gov. So again, 1 to 3 business days. And if they're satisfied, they'll go ahead and assign the library's unique entity identifier. And after that is assigned, you can then proceed with registration. Okay, so now on to entity registration. So this is going to be a walkthrough of what you see, whether you're registering for the first time or you're resubmitting registration. So another caveat here. So I took these screen caps from a meeting I had with a library in mid-April 2026. Now, I think the entity registration portion of SAM.gov is fairly stable now. I'm not expecting any big changes. In the past 2 years, they went through a process of updating everything to remove the legacy system. One second. The old legacy system process, and so now it's got I guess a shinier, newer interface to work with, and that seems to have settled down. So probably these slides are going to be good for a while, knock on wood. So of course, to start the registration, you'll go to the workspace. So you'll notice in the big green oval, you've got circles that will have numbers in them. So you'll need to find your entity in whatever section is relevant, whether it's active registration because you're renewing existing registration that hasn't yet expired. ID assigned, that would be your library has the unique entity identifier, but you haven't yet submitted registration. And then inactive registration, if that registration has lapsed. And again, it's not been 2 years or longer. Then you may also later, after you submit registration, see numbers in the pending or work in progress sections. So you'll click on the circle that has the number in it for wherever your entity is. In this case, it's going to be active registration. Then you'll see an entry for your library. And there should be an update button you can see. If you don't see the update button right away, you may need to click on the More button to bring up a submenu that will have the update or register link there. So you'll enter your relationship to the entity. You want to indicate that you are an employee or officer of the entity, and then check that you are authorized to conduct transactions on behalf of the entity. And then it will ask you what you want to update. So by default, the system will say, I would like to update, renew my entire entity registration. Again, this would be if you're doing a renewal. It is possible to go in and update only the points of contact section without actually resubmitting the registration. But again, that's going to keep your original registration deadline. So if you're coming up close to the deadline, you do want to go ahead and renew the entire thing. Choose an option page. Again, really, really important, making the correct selection here. So it will show the current selection, which hopefully is on financial assistance, since that's the best option for public libraries. So you want to make sure to hit select on that column. Again, we are staying away from all awards because that is a much higher level of effort and scrutiny. So the first time you register an entity, a commercial and government entity code, or CAGE code, will be assigned by the Defense Logistics Agency. So if you're brand new to this, it's not going to have a result automatically fill in. So you'll say, no, I don't have a CAGE code, and then one will be assigned during review. But if you've got previous registration, you do have a CAGE code that's automatically saved with your registration. As far as I can tell, this is the only place this really comes up for libraries. I've never seen another agency or entity request the cage code from a library, but it's there if you need it. We'll talk more about cage code review later on in the presentation. So again, the system will show you the entity type, local government, and the purpose of registration, which should be financial assistance awards. So you'll need to review the current registration information. So hopefully you'll be able to choose the first circle that says this is the correct legal business name and address. But it's possible that the system will try to force an address change. Unfortunately, sometimes the system wants to force a change to incorrect information. For Kentucky libraries, this happens on a regular basis because we used to, years ago, create library construction corporations to handle financing for the construction of a new building. And that is technically a separate entity from the library itself. But since the library construction corporations were typically registered with the Kentucky Secretary of State, that information is in the system. It has the same address as the library. And so SAM's like, oh, we found this official looking information from the Secretary of State. Let's update this. And you don't want to do that because your library is not the same thing as that old construction corporation, which maybe has gone inactive. Libraries really don't use those anymore, at least in Kentucky. So if some of the information is incorrect, you'll have to provide documentation to correct it, and that will add 1 to 3 business days to the process because SAM will have to approve that change before you can move forward. So then you will continue registration. I do want to note here that there's been a change. It used to be that you could opt out of being included in the public search results in SAM.gov. That is no longer the case. All entities in the system appear in the public search results. So you're just going to be confirming that you understand that you're going to be in the public search results. So then you'll see the entity renewal page, and note that you're going to be doing a lot of starting and reviewing for each section. So to get started, under business information, you'll hit start. And then once that section opens, you will hit start again. Do note going down the left that you have navigation indicating the sections of the registration. So you'll be starting sections for business information, taxpayer information, business types, financial information, legal proceedings, points of contact, and the financial assistance response. So the first page for entity name has some optional fields for the website, division name, and division number. And that's really not anything you need to fill in. In general, if something's optional, I usually recommend not filling it in because it's just something else to correct later. And then entity addresses. So this would be where you enter the mailing address if it's different than the physical address, or indicate that they are the same. Then you'll have the entity start date and fiscal close. So you're not going to be asked for documentation here. You do get asked for documentation if you are requesting the UEI for the first time, but when you're going through the registration, they're not going to ask for paperwork here. You then have a review page. Get used to it. There are going to be a lot of review pages except for one section. Then start on taxpayer information. So you'll enter the library's EIN. Do note if you're resubmitting registration, your previous answers are saved, so you're not having to re-enter everything. But if you're doing this for the first time, you'll enter the EIN without the hyphen. You'll then want to select the most recent tax year. Even if your entity doesn't submit taxes, just choose a recent tax year. This page is, again, where we might make some mistakes and have to come back and do this again. So the taxpayer name and address page is where you're providing the information that the IRS has associated with your library's employer identification number, or EIN. So it's possible that your SAM.gov registration will say one version of the name. Maybe it will be like such and such county public library. But on the EIN, on this page, you might be entering something like such and such public library district, or board of trustees, or library service corporation, something different. You want to enter the name exactly the way the IRS has it. And you'll also enter the address the way the IRS has it. It should be the library's physical address. Every once in a while, something goofy happens, and that's not the case. To find that out, you'll want to look at the most recent information you have from the IRS. Some libraries may still have a copy of their original EIN letter where that was assigned to them when they became a thing with the IRS. So a lot of libraries have lost track of that documentation, though. So you can get a replacement EIN letter, also called a 147C letter, by calling the IRS. Be prepared to wait on the line. You're going to talk to the business and specialty tax line. You'll need to confirm some details about your library, and then they can either fax or mail that EIN letter to you. There is not an option for email. For the IRS verification page, you're entering the name of the individual executing consent to disclose the EIN to employees of SAM.gov, other federal government procurement officials, and government personnel performing some kind of government business activities that might be associated with giving your library funding. So often this is the director executing this consent. Then you have a review page, and you will submit this information to the IRS. When you submit this information, you will receive a one-time code via email. So this is not anything to do with the multi-factor authentication code that you get to log into the system. This is very particularly going to your email. You'll also do this again at the very end when you submit the entire registration. Next, on to business types, which is a very short section, so you'll start. And then you have optional business categories. So again, this is optional, but for most Kentucky libraries, you're probably going to choose that you're operating at the local government level, county, or possibly city. But usually county is the best option here. The other entity types would not pertain to a library. And then you get a review page for the business type. All right, on to the financial information section where you will hit start. This is where we're going to do the direct deposit information. First, though, you need to answer a question about whether or not your library accepts credit cards. This does not really impact your registration either way. If you don't, just answer accurately. Not a big deal. Then you'll be entering the payment information. So again, if you were resubmitting registration, your information is saved. But you may need to update that information if you've had a change in routing or account number. So the first time you do this, you need to have that routing and account number handy, as well as the phone number for the bank. They're not asking for your library's phone number here. They want the phone number for the bank. You'll also be submitting a payment or remittance address. They say this is in the event that a direct deposit cannot be made, so they would cut a check, but they're never going to do that. They're just not going to send you your money if you can't get it direct deposited, but they still ask for that information. Now, I do want to point out something that's kind of curious that people have a question about, and that is the EFT number, which is also called the EFT indicator. You'll note for this library, they've only entered one account, its primary account, and by default, that EFT number is 0000. So most Kentucky public libraries are just going to have one account where everything goes. But it's possible if you're getting grants from different federal sources, maybe there are multiple accounts you want things to go through. So it is possible to add another account. You can add multiple accounts to the system by clicking on the green button. And for those subsequent accounts, you get to assign the EFT indicator. So if you are dealing with a federal program and you want it to go somewhere besides the primary account, you have to give them both the UEI and the EFT indicator so that it goes to the correct account. So again, not super common for Kentucky libraries, but just wanted to point that out in case you find yourself in that situation. All right, executive compensation. I would imagine most libraries will answer no because you haven't received $25 million or more in federal funds in the preceding fiscal year. And then, of course, you have a review page. Then you get to start on legal proceedings. So this refers to a situation where your entity or your library has federal contracts or grants totaling $10 million or more that are active. So this isn't that at some point you've accumulated $10 million worth of federal funding. This is you've got active stuff happening. So that could be grant funding from KDLA, that could be a direct grant from some other federal agency. It could be even E-rates. So if you've got 10 million or more active, then you have to report any proceedings filed against your entity in the past 5 years. So in this section, you basically need to indicate, are you subject to these regulations or not. So if you're curious, I've got links to go look at all the particular proceedings that are referenced there. The federal regulations referenced there. But I imagine, again, for Kentucky Public Library, you're going to be answering no to this question. And then you get a review page. Next up is points of contact. So there are 3 points of contact you have to fill in: accounts receivable, electronic business, and government business. Now, I included the definitions for accounts receivable and electronic business. I'll note that for most Kentucky public libraries where you are not a federal contractor, you're just getting financial assistance, you won't really have somebody that will be creating billing statements to submit to the federal government. And you also won't really have someone in charge of authorizing access to federal government electronic business systems. You still have to fill somebody in. Usually it's going to be the library director or bookkeeper. The most important one for your registration is the government business point of contact. So that's the person who is going to be contacted about your entity registration and will possibly answer some additional questions. And it's fine to have the same person for all 3 of these. So on this next page, there are different collapsible sections for accounts receivable, electronic business, and government business. So you need to open each one individually. Do you want to note that something that's confusing is that the system has sort of grayed out suggestions or examples of how you might fill in the information. So a lot of times people will look at this and they'll be like, my middle initial is a B. And the system doesn't think it's your middle initial. It's showing you an example of what a middle initial could be, in case you don't know what a middle initial is. So in any case, any of those kind of grayed out looking entries, they're just going to be blanks. So don't feel like you have to put in a middle initial. You certainly can, but that can be kind of confusing. Then you'll have a page for optional points of contact. You're probably not going to be entering anyone here. This would be past performance or alternates for the various contacts. There is a handy page that gives you or lists the responsibilities for each type of point of contact. And then a review page. On to financial assistance. We are almost done. So financial assistance, this particular section may not have your answer saved. Now, it's possible that this is happening because something weird occurred in the change from the legacy registration system over to this newer system. So I haven't yet worked with a library that has gone through registration in this newer looking system twice. So maybe after you do it once in this new system, it will save the response, but maybe not. So this would be about the only thing where you really have to answer it fresh if you're doing a registration renewal. So you will be answering, yes, you do want federal financial assistance because that includes all the types of assistance we've already discussed. Once you answer yes, you'll get a list of certifications and representations. These are basically about being a good little employer who's going to be a good little grantee with federal funds. If you want to see a full list of the certifications and representations, it's in Appendix 1 on page 16 of that entity registration checklist. So you've probably seen these before if you've ever received a grant from a state library agency like KDLA. And then you skip directly to reviewing. So you'll note that there wasn't a review page right after the financial assistance response, but fear not, we will get to review that as well. So start on review and submit. The first page will have all of the entries except for the financial assistance response. So you've already reviewed everything on this page. And then, ta-da, you get to review the financial assistance response with those certifications and representations. Then you will submit the registration and once more have to enter a one-time code you receive via email. Okay, so your registration has been submitted. Now we get to talk about review. So the review process is up to 3 steps. Everyone will go through step 1, which is the IRS TIN, that's taxpayer identification number, or EIN validation. So again, remember that taxpayer information page where we entered the name that the IRS has with your EIN and the address they have. So this is where the IRS is looking at that information and saying, yes, that's a match for us, you're good to go. So, once you've figured out what they want, you just don't change that information. But if you're doing this for the first time, it's possible that you'll be rejected at this stage and you'll need to figure out exactly what the IRS wants. So you would have to resubmit your registration. So I've had a few libraries, the very first time they did registration, it took them 2 or 3 attempts before they got past this step in the review process. Now, step 2 will definitely come up the first time that you're submitting registration, but periodically will come up again, and that is cage code review. So remember, the cage code is assigned by the Defense Logistics Agency. So this message is going to come from cage review at DLA.mil. So Defense Logistics Agency.military. So this email is kind of long looking. We're going to have some tips on the next slide. But when we break down the email, it's not as bad as it seems. It's all plain text. So to me, it's kind of hard to read. And you're going to have 3 days to respond to this review question. And generally, if you get stopped for cage code review, that's going to add a week to a week and a half to your registration review process before you're approved. So I have linked to an example copy of a cage code review email, and I highlighted the sections that you really want to look at. So the legal business name section is confusing because they give multiple options depending on, what type of entity you are. For Kentucky libraries, you would go under the other section. And so there's a list of acceptable documentation that you can provide as other. And most libraries will choose the option to submit a copy of one set of approved board meeting minutes from the past year. You then have to answer some questions about similar company names where you're clarifying whether you're associated with, say, the Board of Education that's in your county, or maybe there's a public library that has the same name, but they're in a different state. So you just have to basically answer, no, I'm not affiliated with these. You'll need to reconfirm your address, answer some questions like, yes, this is where most of our business operations occur. Yes, we really own this or we lease this, things like that. They're not difficult questions. Every once in a while, to verify the physical address, you may be asked for a copy of a utility bill, but that is very, very rare. Lastly, the point of contact verification is where they're going to ask about that government business point of contact. So you just have to confirm that, yes, that person is really an employee of the library. Yes, that is their work email. Yes, that is their work phone number. Fairly simple. And then last but not least, you get a message that your registration has been activated. Now, I do want to note that however long the review process takes, your registration date starts on the date that you submitted the registration, even if it took a week and a half to 2 weeks to actually get it approved. So remember, registration is good for 1 year at a time, so it will expire on the same date the next year. Okay, really briefly, just some resources. The Federal Service Desk provides support for SAM.gov. Unfortunately, they no longer have a direct phone number that you can call. That has actually been disconnected. I checked. So you can start a live chat with an option to talk to a live agent, or you can create a customer service case. They call these incidents. And when you're looking to create an incident, if you go to the Federal Service Desk page, you've got to scroll down near the very bottom to find the button to choose to start that, because they really want you to look at all the help, like FAQ type information first. There's also a help center for SAM.gov. So there are a lot of FAQs in there for various actions you might take. And then if you are worried about entity registration for E-rate, I've linked to the program administrator for E-rate. They're called USAC. So there's information about that requirement that you need the UEI with active registration when you're filing reimbursement forms starting in August 2026. All right, and then contact information. So if you're a Kentucky Public Library, you get to contact me, your state E-rate coordinator, who also specializes in SAM.gov because it's been very relevant for E-rate purposes. But if you're not dealing with it for E-rate, that's fine. I am still happy to help you with SAM. Now, if you're a library in another state watching this presentation, please make sure to contact your state E-rate coordinator. The American Library Association has a directory of those folks, so you need to go find your person to get some assistance, because alas, I do not have the time to provide SAM.gov support for the entire country. So thank you very much for your time today. I hope this was helpful. And again, if you're a Kentucky Library, please feel free to reach out.